She spent her days checking people into a gym, swiping membership cards, answering the same small-talk questions on repeat. That was Sydnie Christmas, in early 2024, 28 years old, working a 0-hours reception job, quietly wondering whether the dream she'd chased since childhood had already passed her by. A few months later, she was standing on one of Britain's biggest stages being told by Simon Cowell that her performance deserved a score higher than the show had any number for. 2 years after that, she's releasing her first album of original songs, headed for a PBS broadcast across America, and getting ready for a spring tour that stretches across 2 continents. This is the story of everything that happened in between and where Sydnie Christmas actually is right now. To understand why Sydnie's win mattered so much, you have to understand how long she'd been trying to get there. She was born on July 18, 1995 in Gravesend, Kent, and if you'd told her as a kid that she'd end up a singer, she might have laughed. She started out playing rugby, not performing on stage, but the pull toward performance won out, and she eventually trained at the Danby Academy of Performing Arts, graduating in 2014 with a plan to make it in musical theater. Plans don't always cooperate. Her first professional credit came in 2016 with a production of Lazarus at the King's Cross Theatre, and from there, she built the kind of resume that looks impressive on paper, but rarely pays the bills. Cruise ship contracts as a lead vocalist for Royal Caribbean, roles in Grease and Starlight Express at Sea, and eventually, a multi-year stint in Germany performing in the stage production of Starlight Express, where she worked her way up from a swing role covering multiple parts to playing Carrie, one of the show's principal characters. 4 years is a long time to spend in one production, and by the time she left, Sydnie's momentum wasn't translating into the kind of career she'd imagined. She took a 0-hours contract at a gym just to keep money coming in between jobs. It's worth sitting with that for a second. A woman who had spent years on professional stages in front of paying audiences was back to earning minimum wage at a reception desk, uncertain if the industry had any more room for her. There's a version of this story where that gym job is just a footnote, a bit of texture to make the eventual win feel more dramatic. But for Sydnie, it wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was years of her working life, checking people in, resetting equipment, handling the same small complaints on repeat, while somewhere in the back of her mind she was doing the math on how much longer she could keep chasing an industry that hadn't given her much reason to believe it wanted her back. Theater work is notoriously unstable even for performers with strong resumes, and Sydnie's resume: cruise ships, ensemble work, understudy tracks. A long stint abroad was the kind that looked solid from the outside while still leaving someone broke and exhausted on the inside. She had actually tried out for Britain's Got Talent 4 separate times before 2024 and pulled out each time, beaten by nerves, before she ever got in front of a camera. 4 times is a lot. It means 4 separate occasions where she got far enough into the process to seriously consider standing in front of the judges, and 4 separate occasions where the fear won. By the time Series 17 came around, she treated the audition like a last attempt. Either this worked, or she was done chasing it, not as a dramatic ultimatum for the cameras, but as a genuinely private decision she'd made with herself. When Sydnie stepped out to sing Tomorrow from Annie, a song some judges have openly admitted they're tired of hearing on talent shows, nobody in the room expected what came next. It wasn't a cute, safe rendition. It was the sound of someone who had nothing left to lose, pouring every ounce of a decade's frustration into 3 minutes of music. Amanda Holden hit her golden buzzer, sending Sydnie straight through to the semi-finals without a single public vote needed. In the semi-final she chose My Way, the Sinatra standard, and turned it into something that felt entirely her own, controlled, powerful, and emotionally raw, in a way that made it clear her BGT run was building towards something bigger than one good audition. By the time the Series 17 final aired on June 2, 2024, Sydnie Christmas, gym receptionist, 4-time BGT dropout, working-class singer from Kent, walked away with the trophy, the £250,000 prize, and a guaranteed spot at the Royal Variety performance. Here's the detail that tells you everything about who Sydnie actually is. The morning after she won the whole competition, she didn't call an agent or start planning a world tour. She went back to work at the gym. She was still on a 0-hours contract, and in the chaos of winning, she genuinely forgot to hand in her notice. Her manager eventually had to let her go once the touring and recording commitments made it impossible for her to keep covering shifts. It wasn't a stunt, and it wasn't false modesty. It was simply how overwhelmed she was, so caught up in the reality of what had just happened, that quitting a part-time job wasn't even on her radar. It's the kind of detail that made people root for her even harder, because it was proof that the person on stage and the person answering phones at a gym reception desk were the exact same woman. Winning didn't mean the criticism stopped. If anything, it opened a new chapter of it, because Sydnie already had professional theater and cruise ship credits behind her. Some viewers online accused the show of being rigged, arguing she wasn't a real underdog and had an unfair head start over other contestants. Sydnie later spoke about how much that backlash affected her, describing it as genuinely painful and saying it felt like people were questioning her honesty when everything she had shared on the show had been true, and she had a point that got lost in the noise. Professional experience doesn't pay rent. She had spent years on stages around the world and still ended up broke enough to need a reception job. 4 failed audition attempts, years of rejection, and a genuine plan to walk away from performing for good if this last shot didn't land. That's not the profile of someone who had it easy. It was someone standing at the very edge of giving up who happened to also have a strong resume. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, one that shows up around almost every reality competition winner who arrives with some prior experience. Audiences want an underdog story, and the moment a contestant's background looks even slightly polished, a portion of the internet decides the story must be manufactured. It rarely accounts for the reality of the entertainment industry, where thousands of genuinely talented, professionally trained performers never break through simply because opportunity and timing matter as much as skill. Sydnie had the training and the stage experience. What she didn't have for a decade was a single moment where all of it lined up. BGT gave her that moment. The experience critics pointed to as unfair was actually the exact thing that had failed to translate into a stable career for years beforehand. The question after that wasn't whether she could win a talent show. It was whether she could turn one viral night into an actual lasting career. The answer came fast, and it came from names most singers only dream of working with. Within weeks of her win, Sydnie was connected with major players in the musical theater and recording world, eventually landing the opportunity to film a music video on the actual West End set of Starlight Express, the same production she had performed in years earlier while living in Germany, just this time as a headline act rather than an ensemble understudy. That single dropped in the summer of 2024, and it turned out to be the opening move in a much bigger year. On September 20th, 2024, Sydnie released her debut album, My Way, named after the song that many believe secured her the win in the first place. Rather than recording it in a standard London studio, she flew to Prague and tracked the entire album with a live orchestra, a genuinely striking image when you consider that months earlier she'd been answering phones at a gym reception desk. The record leaned heavily on the songs that had defined her BGT run: Tomorrow, My Way, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, alongside modern covers like Imagine Dragons' Believer and the Scripps Hall of Fame, plus a pair of festive tracks for good measure. When it dropped, My Way hit #1 on iTunes both in the UK and in the United States, a genuinely rare feat for a debut record from a British talent show winner. Then came a moment that felt almost too perfect to be real. Lauren Allred, the voice behind Never Enough from The Greatest Showman, and the singer whose version of Over the Rainbow had originally made Sydnie nervous to perform the song in the BGT final, recorded a duet version of the track with her. Before the final had even aired, Lauren had sent Sydnie a message of support, telling her the song now belonged to both of them. Months later, that turned into an actual collaboration between the two. If the album felt like a big moment, what happened next in Los Angeles topped it. In November 2024, producer David Foster, the man behind hits for Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, Michael Bublé, Andrea Bocelli, Barbra Streisand, and dozens of other legends, celebrated his 75th birthday with a concert at the Hollywood Bowl. The lineup included Michael Bublé, Josh Groban, Andrea Bocelli, and Jennifer Hudson. And somewhere in that lineup, 5 months removed from a gym reception desk, stood Sydnie Christmas. Foster was clearly paying attention because months later he showed up in person at one of her own shows. In the spring of 2025, Sydnie made her United States debut with 2 sold-out performances at Sony Hall in New York City. During one of them she performed "I Have Nothing," the Whitney Houston classic that Foster himself co-wrote and produced, one of the most vocally demanding songs in modern pop. Partway through, Foster walked out unannounced and sat down at the piano to accompany her. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. It was one of the most respected producers in music history choosing, on the spot, to back a Britain's Got Talent winner on his own composition. To put that in perspective, David Foster doesn't need to prove anything to anyone at this stage of his career. He spent decades in rooms with the biggest names music has ever produced, and he's not exactly short of talented artists asking for his time. When someone with that level of experience and that much choice decides, mid-show, to walk out and personally accompany a performer, it isn't a favor or a courtesy. It's a professional judgment call from a man who has built a career on knowing exactly who's worth paying attention to. Before any of that Hollywood attention, Sydnie had already delivered one of the most historically weighted performances of her career. As part of her prize package for winning BGT, she performed at the Royal Variety Performance on November 22, 2024, in front of King Charles III, choosing "Believer" from her album. It's a tradition. Don't disappear once the confetti settles and a new champion is crowned. Some of them build entire careers in the years that follow. It also mattered symbolically in a way that's easy to overlook. Talent shows crown a new winner every single year, and public attention almost always shifts entirely toward whoever just won, leaving previous champions to fend for themselves in the years afterward. Being invited back as a guest performer, rather than simply fading into former winner status, signals that the show itself still sees Sydnie as an active part of its story, rather than a name from an old series. For someone whose entire peer BGT career had been defined by being overlooked, that kind of ongoing recognition is its own quiet victory. So where does that leave Sydnie Christmas in the second half of 2026? Busier than ever, and moving into a new phase of her career that looks noticeably different from the cover's heavy debut that first introduced her to American audiences. She's currently preparing her first album of original material, a genuine creative leap from My Way, which leaned on covers of songs she'd performed during her BGT run and beyond. 2 singles from the upcoming record, Lean on You and Run, are already out and have been picking up a strong response from fans on both sides of the Atlantic. The full album is set for release in the fall of 2026. Alongside the new music, Sydnie has a run of us dates this August, including stops in Philadelphia, a return to Sony Hall in New York, and a show at the Center for the Arts in Homer, New York. Smaller, more intimate rooms than a Hollywood Bowl stage, but exactly the kind of setting where her ability to connect with a crowd tends to shine. In interviews around the announcement, she's talked about how much she treasures the loyalty of her American audience, describing the relationship as something closer to family than fandom. She's taken to calling her "us supporters" her family, and has said their support gives her the confidence to keep pushing her career forward. The album campaign doesn't stop at streaming and touring either. A PBS special titled Sydnie Christmas Live in London, filmed at her sold-out Adelphi Theatre concert from September 2025, is set to air across the United States starting in October 2026, putting her performance in front of a national American broadcast audience for the first time. And once that airs, she's already got a full US tour plan for spring 2027, meaning the momentum that started with a gym desk to Golden Buzzer story shows no sign of slowing down 2.5 years later. There's something worth pointing out about the shift toward original material specifically. Cover songs are a safe, proven way to build an early fanbase audiences already know. The melodies, the emotional beats are pre-built, and there's no risk of releasing something that simply doesn't land. Moving to original songwriting is a much riskier step, but it's also the step that separates a talent show phenomenon from an actual recording artist with a lasting body of work. Lean on You and Run aren't just new songs. They're a public test of whether audiences will follow Sydnie's voice into material that isn't already emotionally preloaded by a famous musical or a beloved film soundtrack. Early reception suggests they will. It would be easy to look at everything that's happened since 2024, the Hollywood Bowl, The King, the sold-out tours, the West End villain role, the PBS special, and assume Sydnie Christmas got lucky, that she was in the right place at the right time, and the industry simply opened its doors. But that framing skips the part of the story that actually explains why any of it happened. This is a woman who spent roughly a decade collecting rejections before she ever stood in front of Simon Cowell. She auditioned for the same show 4 separate times and walked away each time because the fear was too overwhelming to push through. She spent years performing on cruise ships and in touring productions across Europe while barely making enough to get by, eventually taking a part-time reception job just to stay afloat. She treated her 5th BGT attempt as her absolute last shot at the industry, win or lose. She was prepared to walk away from performing for good if it didn't work out. What happened after that wasn't a fluke. It was talent that had been quietly developing for a decade, finally colliding with an opportunity. She was ready to seize the moment it arrived. In a social media post reflecting on her first year after the win, Sydnie thanked the people who had supported her, singling out her fans for continuing to show up long after the show itself had ended. It read less like a celebrity milestone update, and more like someone who genuinely couldn't quite believe her own life, grateful rather than entitled about how far things had come. That's really the through line of her entire story. She isn't riding a single viral moment into obscurity the way some talent show winners do. She's building an actual career, one project at a time, an album of covers, then a West End villain role, then an album of original music, then a PBS special, then a returning tour. Every step looks deliberate rather than accidental, the work of someone determined not to waste the opportunity she spent a decade fighting to earn. 2.5 years ago, Sydnie Christmas was clocking in at a gym reception desk, unsure whether her performing career had any road left in it. Today she's got an original album on the way, a PBS broadcast reaching American living rooms, sold-out shows behind her on 2 continents, and a spring 2027 tour already on the calendar. She shared a stage with David Foster, sung for a king, played one of Disney's most